For millions of families during World War II, survival did not come from heroics on the battlefield. It came from something far more ordinary: a loaf of bread, a slice shared at a kitchen table, a crust saved for tomorrow. When supply chains collapsed, farms were bombed, and imports vanished. Bread became the backbone of human survival across Europe, Asia, and beyond. In cities under blackout, in villages cut off by fighting, and in refugee camps filled with uncertainty, bread was often the only reliable food left. It was cheap to make, easy to divide, and dense enough to keep people standing when nothing else was available. This is the story of how bread kept millions alive when the world was falling apart. Why bread became the centre of wartime survival. Before the war, many families enjoyed varied diets. Meat, dairy, fresh produce and imported foods were part of everyday life. That vanished almost overnight. Naval blockades cut off grain shipments. Railways were destroyed. Farms were seized or abandoned. Fuel shortages crippled food transport. And, governments faced a terrifying reality. If they did not stabilise food supplies, entire populations could starve. Bread offered a solution. Grain could be stored for years. Flour could be transported in bulk. Bakeries could operate with limited equipment. And most importantly, bread could be rationed precisely. By standardising bread production, governments could guarantee every citizen at least one reliable source of calories per day. It was not luxury. It was survival mathematics. So, how was wartime bread different from the bread folks were used to, you might wonder? Well, the bread during the Second World War was nothing like the soft white loaves many people knew before. See, white flour required heavy processing, and honestly, it wasted a lot of valuable nutrients. During the war, governments actually ordered mills to use nearly the entire grain. That meant the bran, the germ, and even the husk were left in. The result of all that was, a dark, dense, heavy bread. People often called it the national loaf, war bread, or even black bread. It was rough, chewy, and, I must say, very filling. In Britain, Germany, and all across occupied Europe, bread was sometimes mixed with potatoes, oats, barley, or even ground chestnuts, just to stretch out the flour supplies. And in the most extreme shortages, sawdust and cellulose were, rather quietly, added in small amounts. The taste, let's be honest, was poor. The texture was harsh. But, it delivered calories, fibre and minerals that kept bodies functioning. People learned to appreciate that heaviness. A light loaf, that meant hunger. A heavy loaf, though, that meant survival. Rationing during the war was, incredibly strict. Every person received these coupons, and those little slips of paper decided exactly how much bread you could buy. If you didn't have the coupons, you simply couldn't get any bread at all. In many countries, adults were allowed as little as 200 to 300 grams per day. Children, thankfully, received just a bit more. And for those doing heavy manual labour, sometimes they were given a little extra. Families, honestly, planned their entire lives around those precious slices of bread. Each piece was eaten slowly, almost reverently. Every single crumb was carefully collected. Stale pieces? Well, those were soaked in water or milk to make them edible again. Leftover crusts were dried out and ground into crumbs. Nothing, absolutely nothing, was wasted. In cities like London, Berlin and Leningrad, bread lines would form before dawn, you see. People waited for hours, often in the cold and rain, just hoping the bakeries hadn't run out. And when bread deliveries failed, panic would spread instantly. Bread wasn't just food. It was, in a way, security itself. How families made bread last longer, well, it was absolutely crucial. Survival depended on stretching every loaf, you know. Many households would slice bread thinly using string or wire instead of knives, just to avoid any waste. Some folks, they'd even cut slices the night before, so the moisture would settle and help prevent crumbling. Bread was often toasted again and again to dry it out and, well, extend its shelf life. Hard bread could last for weeks, believe it or not. Later on, it would be softened with a bit of soup or water. Families got creative and came up with these false meals, where bread filled plates that otherwise would have been empty. Things like bread soup, bread porridge and bread dumplings became pretty common. Out in the countryside, families would bake in big batches to save on fuel. Just one oven firing might turn out dozens of loaves meant to last the whole month. Sharing became the norm, really. Neighbours would trade bread for vegetables, firewood, or even help with repairs. In those times, bread practically became its own currency. How bread prevented mass starvation. Without bread rationing, millions would have died, you know. Historical records show that countries which maintained stable bread supplies suffered far fewer civilian deaths from hunger. Britain's carefully managed grain imports and ration system prevented widespread famine. Even Germany, during the late war collapse, prioritized bread. The Soviet Union, for its part, redirected massive resources just to keep grain transport moving. Where bread failed, disaster followed. During the siege of Leningrad, rations dropped to as low as 125 grams per day. That bread was mixed with sawdust and pulp, believe it or not. Even so, it delayed mass death long enough for relief routes to open. Bread did not end suffering, it slowed it. And sometimes just slowing was enough to save lives. What wartime bread taught about human endurance. Living on bread alone was brutal, absolutely brutal. People lost weight, teeth decayed, energy disappeared, immune systems weakened. Yet people kept working, caring for children, repairing buildings and supporting war industries. Remarkable, really. Bread gave just enough strength to continue, you know. It also taught discipline. People learned portion control, delayed gratification, and resource management. Children grew up understanding that food was never guaranteed. Those lessons, well, they stayed with them for life. Many survivors later said they never wasted bread again. How modern people can learn from wartime bread. Today, most people have never experienced true food insecurity. Shelves are full. Waste is common. World War II shows how fragile that system can be. Learning to bake simple whole-grain bread store flour properly and ration portions are practical skills even now. Understanding how to stretch calories teaches resilience. A basic loaf, made with flour, water, yeast and salt, can still sustain life. Why bread remains a symbol of survival. During World War II, bread was more than food. It was hope. It was routine in chaos. It was proof that tomorrow might still come. Every slice represented cooperation between farmers, millers, bakers, drivers and governments. Entire societies worked together to keep bread moving. When everything else failed, bread remained. That is why survivors remembered it so clearly, not for its taste, but for its power to keep them alive. If you value real history, practical survival knowledge, and lessons from the past that still matter today, make sure to subscribe, share this video, and stay with this channel. Because understanding how people survived before us may one day help us survive again.